In this video, I would like to say a few words about the second period of Shakespeare's literary career, which lasted from the year 1601 to 1608. As you probably remember, in the second period of his literary work, Shakespeare mainly focused on tragedies. That was the predominant genre because this period is known as the pessimistic or the black period of Shakespeare's life and career. However, first of all, I should say that his first two tragedies Shakespeare created during the first period of his literary career, actually, and these two tragedies were Julius Caesar and Romeo and Juliet. But these two tragedies are really different from the later tragedies. If we take a look at Romeo and Juliet, for example, in spite of its tragic end, this tragedy does not depress the reader. In fact, it presents so complete the victory of love, so vivid the colors, and it is so full of youth and beauty that the reader actually feels quite hopeful and full of youthful optimism after reading it, despite the tragic events that happen to the characters in it. Speaking about Romeo and Juliet, I suppose there is no need to comment on the plot of the tragedy because I'm quite sure you all know it very well, as Romeo and Juliet is known to all parts of the world as the most famous tragedy of love. I would just like to remind you that the action of Romeo and Juliet is not set in England, it is set in Verona, Italy, and that is because the plot of this tragedy was not original, it was not made up by Shakespeare, but it was borrowed by him borrowed from an old Italian romance translated into English in the previous years. Speaking about the main problem of the tragedy, the main problem is that of love, and in this play, love is raised to a deep social problem, unlike the comedies of the first period. In the comedies, love was presented as a power that can defeat any enemies and overcome any obstacles, but not more than that. And in this tragedy, love is treated as a serious tragic subject, finally, which shows us quite clearly Shakespeare's soon transition to the second period of his literary career. Romeo and Juliet are the victims of a long and senseless feud between their families. Feud can be translated into Russian as vражда, and their families, the Montagues and the Capulets, stick to this feud because of medieval traditions and patriarchal morality, but Romeo and Juliet themselves don't support these ideas any longer because they are representatives of their age, the Renaissance. They are the younger generation that is very clearly opposed to the older generation supporting and sharing all of those ideas. And the death of the young people makes the older generation realize the absurdity of their feud and leads to the reconciliation of the two families. So this gives the readers hope that this tragedy is not going to repeat itself ever, and because of that the tragedy ends in an optimistic mood, we can say. And in these pictures you can see some illustrations to Romeo and Juliet. Speaking about Shakespeare's tragedies written later during the second period, they show us the author's disillusion, hopelessness, and disappointment. This period is often called Shakespeare's Black Period, and many scientists link it to the death of Queen Elizabeth because Elizabethan age was really favorable for literature and arts, but the next king could not, could change things a lot, and could become not the situation could become not so favorable for writers. So Shakespeare was probably worried about that, and also his tragedies become more philosophic. The question that his characters ask again and again is, what is a man? And in many ways this was actually the question of the age. Shakespeare's tragedies of this time are the stories of revenge, jealousy, and ambition, but of course they touch on many other subjects too. The idea that they have in common is that mankind is constantly trying to go beyond its limits in order to achieve perfection and harmony in the world. But mankind itself is not perfect, so it always fails in these attempts. In other words, humanity cannot reach a perfect life in a perfect world, because humanity itself is not perfect, but it's flawed. And each tragedy of this period portrays some noble figure caught in a difficult situation. But a man's tragedy is not individual, it is spread to other people as well. So the fate of the main character affects the life of other characters as well. And Shakespeare's characters of this period are personalities of great depth and unusual intellect. At the same time, he has created some real and ordinary men, so they are quite true to life people, despite this outstanding character that they have. The most significant tragedies of this period are Hamlet, Othello, King Lear, and Macbeth. I would like to focus on Hamlet in a bit more detail now. Hamlet is a philosophical drama, the tragedy of a humanist, and it is the most widely staged, read, and discussed of all Shakespeare's tragedies. As one of the scholars of literary studies put it, Hamlet is the play of all the plays ever written that the world least willingly would be without. The plot of Hamlet was not original either. It was not made up by Shakespeare, but it was borrowed from the play by Thomas Kidd, one of the university wits. But Shakespeare changed many details of the play, including the time settings. The original play was set in the Middle Ages, but Shakespeare changed that for the Renaissance, and he provided the play with the setting of a contemporary Renaissance court, and he made his leading character, Prince Hamlet, a real typical portrait of a man of Renaissance. Well, I'm sure that you know the plot very well as well, so I'll just focus on the main outline. Well, Prince Hamlet suspects that his dead father, King of Denmark, was murdered by his uncle Claudius, who has married his mother and become king. And the ghost of his father informs him about the murder and tells him to revenge, and Hamlet promises to revenge, but then on second thought he decides to check the words of the ghost, and so it takes him a long time before he finally revenges. Hamlet is a thinker whose hesitation and inability to act caused the tragic development of the play. He kills Claudius at the end of the tragedy, but is badly wounded himself. The queen, his mother, is poisoned by the drink intended for Hamlet, and his love Ophelia is drawn, and her brother and her father are killed by Hamlet by accident. So, as I have said already, the tragedy does not only affect the main character, but also the people around him. And Shakespeare depicts Hamlet in the struggle of one against many. Actually, Hamlet is one of the most difficult tragedies to interpret, I should say, in the whole world literature, and no work of world literature has caused so many explanations as this one. The reason for that is Hamlet's behavior. Hamlet's behavior is not always logical. It changes a lot throughout the play. First of all, we see Hamlet as a typical man of the Renaissance. He is well educated and noble. He is open-hearted, clever, and generous. He loves life and he believes in man, and he is full of hopes and noble desires. But then suddenly, all of those noble desires and hopes are crash tested against the harsh reality of life, and when he finds out the terrible truth. And Hamlet grieves that injustice triumphs over justice, that a cruel ruler is tyrannizing the people, and that his beloved country has become a prison for people. So his struggle is not only a personal matter, it's also a political one, because Hamlet is the prince, but he can see that Claudius, who is the king currently, is a bad king for his country, while Hamlet himself has a lot of appreciation for his people and cares for them a lot. But this, so in the end, this contradiction between his noble ideals and reality is one of the main reasons for Hamlet's disappointment. And, well, as I have already said, Hamlet's behavior changes quite often. Because of that, we can say that he is a double-sided character, or probably even a many-sided character. Generally speaking, he is courageous, he does not fear to look the truth in the face, and he knows that revenge is easy, but well, he wants not just revenge for his father's death. He wants to set the world aright. He wants to make everything right, and he wants justice to win. Therefore, he decides to act to unveil the crimes of Claudius to the people and to establish the reign of justice in Denmark. So Hamlet's capacity for action and his decisiveness and initiative are one part of his nature. But on the other hand, he doubts, he puts things off, he falls into complete pessimism and avoids action. Hamlet meditates a lot on the problems of life and death, struggle and irresolution, love and hatred, and his thoughts are well reflected in his famous monologues, such as "To be or not to be, that is the question." He passionately seeks the key to the understanding of life, and he is ready to spend his whole life trying to make things right and correct. And Hamlet actually hesitates because he's afraid to take a false step which might lead him against his humanist ideals. In other words, he's not afraid of acting itself, but he's afraid of hurting some innocent people while doing so. So Hamlet is not a fighter by nature. He is a learned man, a philosopher, and Hamlet achieves his aims at the end of the tragedy because his victory is that he has overcome his own doubts. He has come to a final decision that he's satisfied with. And all in all, Hamlet is one of the greatest characters in world literature, and the play itself is the internal drama of a human soul, which is quite unique. And one other genre that Shakespeare worked in the second period was the genre of comedy, but just like tragedies, the comedies of this period are really different from the comedies of the first period. They can be called dark or black comedies, and you can see some examples in the screen. All is Well That Ends Well and Measure for Measure are quite well known, but they are not the merry, optimistic and life-loving comedies of the first period. They are really different, they have different messages and different problems.